Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. As Ankur mentioned, we couldn't be more thrilled to share this perspective with all of you. This is intended to be an interactive session, so please chat as questions and ideas come up. I did want to start with obviously the context, which is extraordinarily unique and as all of you know, quite sobering, is around what is going on around the world with respect to COVID-19. McKinsey has a perspective, and I would just share a handful of things here and then point you to our website, mckinsey.com, where you can find a full briefing on our view on COVID-19, particularly around the business and economic impacts, and as well as looking at responses by sector. Obviously, it's extremely dynamic and fluid, and so something that changes with each passing day and hour. But this has been our attempt to try to brief the world around what we're seeing. First and foremost on this chart, page 5, is this is clearly a humanitarian crisis first and foremost. And I hope just on a personal level that all of you are safe and healthy where you are. I can only imagine the difficulty that all of us are facing. I know for my family, this has been incredibly disruptive, if nothing else. And I know many people are suffering out there. And you can see some of these numbers, which every day have increased relatively dramatically around the world at different stages. And if you go to the next chart on page 6, this could evolve in so many different directions. From a planning perspective, McKinsey has aligned around now these two scenarios, one called a delayed recovery, which is relatively speaking a more modest scenario, where effectively we see the gains from Asia improving, and then basically as the summer comes, we see a little bit of a moderation in the impacts from the virus. Then obviously a worse scenario we're calling prolonged contraction, where you actually see reinfection in Asia as those countries, as it looks, it's been more moderating, but impacts start to rise again. And then we see that the virus is not actually seasonal, and this creates an even longer impact in terms of disruption to human life and economic activity. Interestingly, we used to have 3 of these scenarios. One was even more benign, but we've now determined that it's likely these 2. Anyway, and so what you'll see is a lot of our materials go based on what do we see in different sectors as a result of these 2 scenarios. I won't go in further on this. We have other webinars that go deep on this topic of how this could evolve and impact different sectors, but we thought it would be important to at least tee this up and let folks be aware of some of the research that's out there. Now I just want to hand it off to my colleagues. We've got an incredible panel here, Kate and Raphael, who've been living this in different parts of the world, who've been leveraging some of the experiences that we've seen as COVID-19 has affected business life and how it impacts teams at McKinsey, but also teams at our client institutions around the world. So I'll pass it over to them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, guys. So real pleasure to be here this morning. And, this is going to be a little bit scrappy, as I'm sure many of your business functions feel like that at the moment too. But we've just been overwhelmed by how many people have reached out and said, hey, you guys work remotely all the time. What can we learn from that? And what have you seen happen in Asia, in Italy, in other areas that are sort of slightly ahead of the curve on this? What have you seen happening there? And what can we learn from that? And I think one of the reasons that so many people have turned out across time zones today is because this stuff is hard. And we can, flipping the switch to say, right, the whole organization is going to go to remote working is a big deal. And so what we're going to try and do today and make it as interactive as possible, I hope, is just share a few of the lessons that we've seen across the globe from our clients, from other organizations, that we know well, and also, frankly, from ourselves as well. I have looked after McKinsey's technology as our CTO for the last sort of 4 or 5 years. And that's hilarious. This shows you the challenges of what remote working is. The printer's just gone off behind me randomly, so I apologize for the noise. But the point here is we have some learnings to share, but we also want to share with each other. And what's going to be really important today is that you use the chat, you use the breakouts, and you tell us kind of what's top of your mind. What are you grappling with? What are you struggling with? And we'll see if we can together just share a little bit more about what we're all seeing. So first and foremost, I wanted to sort of touch on the page that you see on the screen, because often when we talk about how remote teams work, we go straight to the technology as the answer. And what we're finding is, of course, the technology is important. You need to be able to have the ability to communicate with each other, to share ideas, to be connected. But actually, the technology is only one small part of that. And where this really, really hits the road is in thinking about, the people element of this, how the structures of the way your teams work need to change, as well as all the processes that sit around that. So we're going to dive into, over the course of the next sort of 10-15 minutes, we're going to dive into each of these areas a little bit further, and talk about what are we seeing, what are some of the tips and tricks against each of them. So I'm going to pick off, just before we do, I'd love to hear, just to get us started on engaging a bit with this. I'd love to go to a poll and just say, across each of these 4 dimensions, so people, structure, process, and technology, which is the element of this that you're finding hardest in your organization shift to remote working? Because it'll also help us to just dive deeper into that particular area as we go forward. Can we put the poll up, guys? Okay, you should see on your screen 4 different options there. Just click which one you're finding the hardest. So look, clearly all 4 are challenging, but maybe a little bit more emphasis on the people side. And I can see Andrew as well has put a few thoughts in the chat around actually how do we keep people connected, and how do we think about a sense of togetherness in this time. So let's dive into some of those. So let's go to people first. The realities of remote working, once the sort of the initial halo has worn off, where you say, yay, I don't have to go on the tube every day, and I can sit at home and I can make cups of tea when I want cups of tea, and all the rest of it, and that sounds like such a great proposition. And then the reality is about 24 hours in, really hit home. And unfortunately, the realities for our people of remote working, particularly in this time, also revolve around, gosh, well, I'm working and I've got to homeschool the kids because the schools are shut, and I'm working, but I've got to try and get that elusive grocery order to my home, because otherwise, if I don't get that slot, I can't feed the family for the next few days. As well as obviously the challenges of dealing with maybe sick family members, elderly parents, and the real challenge in all of this is, it's not necessarily the working part of it, but the fact of the extra pressures that it's putting on our people of the remote part. And so I'm just going to share those results. There we go. And so when we think about our people and the leadership challenges we have with looking after our people, the first and most important thing is, how do you make sure that they are safe, right? Then how do you make sure that they can work effectively? And we're just seeing a few, really interesting sort of themes around how you create that togetherness. One idea, for example, the number of companies have started with is, how do you think about the daily check-in? How do you actually get, your team of, maybe it's 5 people, maybe it's 20 people, on something like a Zoom where you're all in gallery view and you can check in the morning. And I've got colleagues that work remotely all of the time, and they spend the first part of their day just talking to somebody at 8 o'clock in the morning. And maybe it's just, a family member or a cousin or something who also remote works. Maybe it is their boss. But how do you start the day with a level of connection that then, embeds that in the rest of what you do? A second idea, of course, is, how do you actually energize the team? It is, we're seeing enormous tolls on people's mental health, mental well-being, as a result of working remotely. One of the things that you really need to think about here is, what's the recipe for psychological safety of your people? And one of the things we've seen work really well within this is, how do you give them a shared sense of purpose? If you're a classic digital team and you're working, in super agile ways already, and we'll talk about this a bit more in structure too, in some ways it's very easy to you're used to working in OKRs, outcomes and key results type ways. But for many people, they're not used to that at all. And giving a shared sense of purpose makes a really big difference to the day. If we take a company like Resure over in Asia, which insurance company, over the kind of New Year period, they basically took the decision that they wanted to develop a product around offering insurance cover free of charge to any frontline medical workers, right? Now, on one level, that's great. It's a clear sense of purpose and so on. But on an even more important level, what we saw is it meant that the people working on that project, they were willing to work, significantly longer hours around it. They worked right the way over Chinese New Year just to get this product out because it felt so important and they felt part of something. So whatever it is that you do, whatever challenges that you have, thinking about what's that shared sense of purpose that will help you create this notion of togetherness, for and with your people. And then the last thing I would just give as an example as well around this, and we'll talk much more about this more deeply in the breakouts, is also this notion of how do you mobilize, how do you connect the dots? How do you bring people together in this way? We're just seeing, a huge amount of levity needed, right? And sometimes that levity comes because your printer goes off behind you in the background. Sometimes it comes because your children keep your feet on the ground on it. But often it's just, how do I share something funny, something nice that I saw today? And how do I use the different channels? And we'll talk about this in technology, things like Slack and so on. How do I use those to create that levity in the day? It's great when you're at the water cooler and you're, making the cup of tea or cup of coffee or whatever, and people are naturally colliding. But you have to create those collision moments when you're all working separately. I have one group actually internally within McKinsey that has started cocktail hour on Zoom. And so we actually get together as a team. We're about, this particular cell is about sort of 40, 50 people. And at 5, 6 o'clock, everyone brings their own tipple, whether it's alcoholic or not, doesn't matter, brings their own tipple, the quarantini, as it's being affectionately called. And they just talk. They talk about what they've done in the day. They talk about what challenges they've got. It doesn't have to be work, but what you're looking for is how do I create those connectivity points in order to keep the togetherness going. Okay, let's move on to talk about the next bucket if we can move it forward. Raphael, I'd love to hear your thoughts on structure and so on, because I think working in China, you've just seen some incredible shifts in the way that teams work that I'd love to bring to the group.
I think the China experience, this happened over Chinese New Year, so people were basically coming back to work after the holidays and figuring out how to best work together. One of the big learnings that I had on my own teams, and I also saw many clients have, is that you need to restructure the way that you work and the way that the company works. Because that mesh of conversations that you have around the water cooler, around the coffee shop, around just meeting in the office, you don't have if you're remote. So if there's unclarities, if you don't know whom to talk to, if dependencies happen between teams, particularly also with new colleagues join, there is this sense of getting lost and not knowing what to do. So what has been quite helpful actually for many business units is to structure teams much, much smaller. Borrowing from this agile principle of small empowered teams, cross-functional setups that really can get together and get stuff done, which have a clear objective that they can execute against. Small teams also help because you can spend more time together. So for example, I've seen teams setting up their virtual team room on Zoom and be always on as a default, making it very easy to connect still on a personal basis. It's also helpful if you have busy calendars because it becomes almost impossible, particularly for senior people, to manage their calendars via video conference to be right in the meeting that they were supposed to be in. So small cross-functional teams. And then from a top-down perspective, really sharing a clear direction with these teams against what to execute and putting in place mechanisms that allow these teams to synchronize, that allow to bring up dependencies, and that allow you to understand if things are not working and how to solve for them. If you move on to page 13, this kind of goes in tandem with setting clear objectives and measurable results. So one big shift that has happened in China is a bit of a move away from management by FaceTime to management by outcomes. So many banks, for example, shifted away their sales forces from, of course, meeting customers. Many sales forces in banks, for example, were shifted away from working in person to working remotely. And so in order to enable that, a few things had to happen. The first one, of course, is people needed the tools. They needed the leads for which banks created dedicated tools, but they also needed much more frequent performance management. So clear small teams that had goals about reaching out to their customers enabled by tools, and that as a team were coming together on a weekly basis to review performance and to create more transparency. Now, this kind of performance management needs to happen also at a level where there is psychological safety for people to speak up. Because as a manager, it's very difficult to really know what's going on if you're not close to your team. And in remote, unless you ask, unless you spend time on one-on-ones with your colleagues, unless you really try to encourage your folks to speak up, what happens is you don't really have transparency anymore. And so this combination of performance visibility, creating a single source of truth of what the team was working on, what they were executing against, but also making it a very constructive dialogue with people, how to improve productivity together, how to improve performance together, letting people speak out about what was not working, really helped to get that balance right between being performance driven, but also being empathetic and caring about the individual to speak out. Together with that, if you go to page 14, comes at a team level, but also at a cross-team level to set up a structured cadence. Structure is really important, particularly for companies that hate structure in this remote working environment. Many companies typically get by, particularly in sort of this spirit of being together, the time you can meet people, you can have ad hoc conversations, but those don't just happen as much in remote work. You actually need to plan for your cadence. And so what I've seen teams do is at a team level, have a daily check-in, check-out, quickly synchronize on the work that needs to get done, discuss your blockers. Also have a weekly session where as a team you get together, you update each other on what's the plan for the week, what are you trying to achieve, making sure that people work on the value-adding things that they do. Building in breaks during their daily working hours in order to also make sure that as a team, there is a time for personal stuff. It needs a cultural shift also. As a manager, you need to be comfortable with more ambiguity. You need to be comfortable with letting go, but you also need to really sense and think more ahead of where the hidden problems are, because you can't really sense them on the ground. So you need to anticipate them more and check in with your teams. Now, the question now is, how do you really then coordinate across teams? Take a look at page 15. This is one solution that a team came up with at a product development company. The context in this case is that the company was building a new business, which involved 200 people that had been working together on-site co-located before Chinese New Year, but then suddenly all shifted to working from home. The launch date didn't really shift. So what did they do? They created a very structured handover process with clear stage gates of how the different user stories, epics, requirements, designs make their way and flow through the different collaborators. That made it much clearer for the individuals in the team whom to talk to, whose roles and responsibilities were what, and to create the linkages that allowed them to get inputs at the time that they needed. This workflow of getting stuff done was supported through the use of digital tools. You see a range of digital tools here, and of course, these are just examples. There's many others like them out there as well. So Zoom and InVision, for example, the combination of being on video, but co-editing content, co-sharing content, having visually the same thing to look at. Sketch a design software, InVision a prototyping software, Jira a tool to do task management. All of these came in to really work together as a team and get work done and flow it through. Maybe, Kate, do you want to talk a little bit more about the different kinds of tools that you've seen effective remote teams use to really stay connected and work together?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also going to pick up on some of the points made in the chat, which I fully subscribe to around, what about the tech detox side of this as well? I think when we think about the technology side, being able to work remotely starts with some of the very basics around technology, right? You have to have a fast internet connection, right? And one of the big challenges we're finding is as people go and work from home, two challenges exist. One is you're entirely reliant on the bandwidth that they happen to have going into their houses, right? And your control, certainly as a CTO, diminishes. And secondly, as the whole family starts to, be in quarantine and so on at home, particularly if you have teenage children or anything like that, the Netflix downloader, as they're affectionately known, is also sucking bandwidth, as you go, right? So first thing to think about is, do you feel that your people have a way of maintaining at least strong enough bandwidth for the rest to, work? Second is then, does your VPN stand up to the load? If I'm someone like C-Trip in Asia that's been working remotely, all the time, it's absolutely fine. They know their VPN can stand up to that. If I'm someone that's never really had to test that before, from a disaster recovery point of view or anything else, much harder. So really making sure that with your technology teams, you're figuring out what kind of load do you expect to get through the VPN, and how are you managing for that, explicitly as you go. And then you can start to say, well, how do I, once I've got the basics in place, how do I empower my employees through a suite of more sort of software as a service type technologies? And we just put a few up here. But the way to think about it, I think, is less about the tools themselves, the products themselves, because you'll all have your own suites of that. But rather, what's the thing I need to do, right? As an employee, right? So sometimes I need to be able to create content. I'm going to have to do stuff. I'm going to have to make stuff, and I need to be able to share that and so on. On video conferencing, I need to be able to talk to people. I've got to do the real-time problem solving. What's my mechanism for being able to do that? Whether it is I've got to work through a task list, and I need that task list to be something that that I can collaborate on, as opposed to just now that I'm not physically with people, as well as things like culture. So how am I actually keeping that levity up? How am I helping people to engage beyond just the day-to-day working? And so the thing that I think works really well on this is less getting embroiled in the specific tools, and more thinking about what's the outcome that I'm trying to achieve here? What do I need to enable my people to do? And then there's a raft of tools that I can use in order to do that. The second thing that I think we're seeing on top of this, of course, is let's call it wonderful entrepreneurship among organizations. But that can be a real headache for your technology team. And what I mean by that is, in the scrappiness of just needing to get stuff done, just needing to get productive, what you'll find is a lot of employees will start using tools that maybe don't meet your security requirements as an organization, perhaps don't protect your data in the way that you would like that to be able to be protected. And we're seeing a lot of pressure on the security side of technology, both in trying to figure out what the new attack vectors are going to be, but also in trying to, without locking down that productivity, that entrepreneurialism, helping people to understand what your safe way of doing any of those tasks is. Because what you'll find is a lot of colleagues maybe just don't know that a different solution exists. And what you need to be able to do is, really, really help people, help people to understand what solutions you have, how they can use them, how they can get, training around that and so on, in order to be as effective as possible. So yes, think about the technology, but think about it from what your colleagues need to do, what your suite of solutions are that that enable them to do that, and then what else do you need to solve for as a second order, third order effect of people just trying to be entrepreneurial and trying to be productive, but unfortunately opening up new attack vectors, new loopholes for you in the system. Now, All of that is great from a, from a technology point of view. And you'll see on the page here, page 18, a bunch of kind of, if you like, watch outs around some of this, right? So things like working in public areas, are they actually securing the Wi-Fi so that they're not just leaving everything open on your systems? Do they understand how to do that kind of thing? Do they understand how to encrypt files and collaborate in a safe way on different things? But the thing I want to spend a bit more time on is the tech detox, because unfortunately, with all of the advent of all of these services, and many of them now being offered free by the multinationals that operate them, just in order to get their products out there, is that if you're anything like my day, you end up back to back completely for a longer proportion of the day than you did before, on calls, on Zooms, interacting with colleagues and so on, because you're all trying to do that real time. Couple of tips. Tip number one, you have to get to, a little bit like Raphael was saying, you have to get to what your new normal structure of your day is. And now that we're all 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe more into this, using the pause point, maybe you do it this weekend, the pause point to just say, okay, now I know what I know. Now I know what demands I have on my week. How do I want to run my day? What does what does a productive day look like for me? And that will be different for different people. So do I need to start the day actually doing some exercise, right? Do I need to make sure that I have 20-minute blocks in the day for different things? I'm moving away from the classic 1 hour construct, and actually I can be more productive. So all my meetings go to 20 minutes by default, not an hour. Can I think about what the other things are that I can build into my day to make sure that I've got blocks in it? And for those of you that have assistants, have you spent time with them, helping them to understand, how they can help you to construct your day in the right way, as well as engaging with your teams? What do they need? Some of you on the chat have been highlighting what works for one team member really doesn't for others. You'll find that team working differences get exacerbated when you're working remotely. So for let's pick a really obvious one, the extrovert versus the introvert. When you've got 20 people on a Zoom call, brilliant for the extrovert, fabulous, terrible for the introvert. How are you making sure that you're getting their opinions front and center into your debates, into your content and so on? Another one to think about as well is what about the people that are maybe not working in core teams, that they actually have quite a sole way of working in what they do? Sometimes we see that actually with people, let's say in a finance role, where actually they don't interact with a lot of people during the day, right? How do you keep them sane while they're remote working, right? So thinking almost on a person of one basis of your team. How do they work? What do I know about them as a human? The way that they tick, the way that they learn, the way that they interact. And how do I make sure that I'm adjusting my day as the leader in order to get the best out of my team and to help them work in the best way for them too. But I think, what we're finding is you need to create the pause point to get back control over your diary, because otherwise, unfortunately, the technology is so darn good now, it will just suck up the rest of the day unless you put the human element back into this to say, what do I need to be effective in all of this? But yeah, the top tip of don't be beholden by the classic 1 hour structure. Use this as a great opportunity to say, I can do it in 20-minute bursts. What would it take to make my yesterday be a third of the time that it actually took me to do that? Let me just, can we page on one more? Fab. I wonder, Raphael, because you know these guys super well, but just to think about how do we bring this together? Because in many ways, and you see this with the first vote that we thought about at the top, in many ways, we shouldn't think about these as isolated things. It's not about just getting everything right on people or just getting everything right on technology. It's actually about how those 4 dimensions work together and how you do it in an integrated way. So do you want to have a little riff maybe
Yep.
around page 20, Raphael?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right, Kate. It's really about the combination of things that need to be in an interplay. It starts, so this is the case example of a leading global tech company, which has adopted remote work as a policy. Many of the office workers are also team work together in quite seamless ways. So there's a few norms they came up with, a few ways of doing certain things. Culture of collaboration, right? Some of the earmarkings of that is be respectful of people's schedule, be respectful of the times that they can work, the time zones that they have, be respectful if they're at home that yes, the kid might run by, might need a little break or things like that. Do scheduling ahead of time. In their case, the calendar is holy, it's accessible, it's visible. So you don't have to schedule things if you're scheduling your own calls and meetings. If you need input from folks, contact them. Many of these collaboration softwares allow that, be it on Confluence or Slack or Microsoft Teams. You really need input. This brings to a culture where you empower your teams, you trust your teams as a manager, but as a team member, you also take responsibility. You get work done, you communicate proactively upwardly, and you create alignment that you're really going into the right direction. On the structural side, they adopted this notion of smaller cross-functional teams that have clear objectives and key results, so clear OKRs that they are pursuing rather than just KPIs, linking the work of the team back to concrete outcomes that they want to achieve. There's a high degree of autonomy that's delegated down, and that allows these smaller teams to be much more agile, much more flexible in the way that they adopt challenges. A great example of another company from China which tackled this is one of the large retailers, fashion retailers, which realized nobody was buying their stuff in store anymore. So they really suddenly set up these cross-functional teams to drive online sales, centered them around a vision of, hey, how do we make this shift happen now in this new world? So let's assemble the best people from marketing, sales, product, digital together, and revamp the way that we're doing business, enabled by cross-functional teams. The global tech company then had a few underlying process enablers. So video conferencing as the default, very strong video conferencing solutions. In their own solution, actually, conferences get auto-transcribed, you can have translation and things like that. Screen sharing is quite empowered because as important as seeing the person that you're talking to build a relationship with is to have the same visual content that you co-edit, that you work on together. Groups and folders, the single source of truth. So in their case, they have used their own internal cloud drive to really allow individual contributors to have access rights the way that they can edit documents. Having that single source of truth in general is a really powerful enabler, be it on a shared file drive or be it on a SharePoint software or be it in a Confluence to really make sure that everybody can see and look at the same thing. When it comes to the technology side, they're using all the classical stuff from the video conferencing to the chat messaging to the email. But there is a notion around what communication do you use when, and I also picked this up in the group chat. It can quite often feel with so many chat groups going on now that it's impossible to differentiate the urgent from the important. And that is a cultural shift. I mean, as individual contributors, we need to ask ourselves, do I need input on what I'm asking right now? Can it wait? Does it need a large group of people to solve it together? Is it something which is quickly done by a chat message? So across the company, a very conscious culture of understanding which kind of communication is best suited to the task at hand. And then instilling a culture where people use the right communication tools. So for example, if I need inputs on a document, well, maybe I tag the contributor on the document and let them know by when I need the input. If I need to just quickly check something with a colleague, let's get on Slack and message each other. If the Slack goes more than 15 messages, some of my teams have told me this is the default to get on a video conference. If you need to do deep problem solving, well, then you get on a video conference like the Zoom, where you can co-share your screen, you can co-edit, but you need to make sure to block people's time so they can communicate together. One thing Chinese companies have pioneered quite well, which is not yet that much in use in the West, is speech to text. Alibaba's productivity software DingTalk has very powerful features where, as a manager, you can leave a voice message and it is automatically transcribed, send as SMS, send as chat to all of the people in your team. That makes it very powerful because you can communicate much faster in language, but people can read much faster than they can listen to. So use of all of these productivity tools in very smart ways helps people to communicate even when they're remote. So bringing all of this together is really what makes remote working powerful. How have we sort of seen that in China? When people first shifted into remote work, quite often teams dropped 40–50% in their productivity. But I've seen teams in my work who essentially made a productivity contract with each other, who said, okay, every week, let's review. What can we do? How can we work better? How can we optimize our way of working? You get on a retrospective together. Somebody opens up a Word document or you use some voting tool, and you write down what's working, what's not working. You problem solve. How can we improve? Adopting that mechanism then really has helped many of them to get back to normal and in some cases even higher productivity levels.
Just reflecting on this session and conversation, one actually big takeaway for me, which I hadn't quite frankly thought about until this moment, was around the ergonomics. I actually work from home a lot, but I'm realizing that that's really increased. And so I think, Kate, you had a bunch of scrappy ideas, even just, putting a few books underneath my laptop or, ways I hadn't thought about personally. And so that's just one key takeaway and something that I can literally do after this session.
Yeah, perfect. And also just keep using the chat if that helps as well, if you're on the phone, if that's an easier way to do it. So yeah, a couple of things. I actually think the ergonomic part of this is really important. So I don't want to sort of belittle it by some of the tips and tricks that I'll talk about. It is a real thing, and we need to make sure that people's backs are protected, that they're not sedentary for too much of the day and so on. But I'll share a few things that I think can be really helpful. Number one is you need to put pressure on the HR department, on the sort of facilities department and so on, to actually say, what are our guidelines for working from home? In the office, you'll have plenty of safe working guidelines that talk about what height the desk is supposed to be, what height the desk relative to the laptop should be, where your sight lines should fit, what the right chair for me is to make sure that my back is protected as I work and so on. There's lots and lots of that for the in-office environment. What we're finding is very few organizations actually had that ready for the home office environment. And of course, some people are working at their kitchen table and some people are working, maybe in a study. We see retailers having massive surges if you're selling desks or selling lamps or any of the things that get you working remotely. So we know this is a challenge. So number one, put some pressure on HR to say, how do we reflect those policies and guidance, right? More than policies. How do we reflect those guidances for the reality of remote working? Number two is there's a ton of stuff online on this, right? So just frankly, Googling, how do I set up my home office in the best way? You find a ton of content around, as I say, sight lines and things like that, how far away from my computer I should be, how far I think about light sources coming in if I'm on VC and so on. So definitely, it's one of the times when I would say Google it. Many things about the current crisis, you'd say, please don't go to Google. But this is not one of them. So definitely doing that. And then a couple of things that I'm seeing people do. So there is the classic, what is my laptop standing on to make sure that it's at the right height for me? Can I think about moving the chairs around in my house? If I've got a chair that is disproportionately better for the way that my back my back sits and so on, can I do that? What do I actually just need to go and buy? And we're seeing lots of HR functions just change their policies and say, go buy it, we'll figure it out afterwards, we'll let you expense it. But in the same way as we're looking after our employees' physical safety from a virus point of view, you have to think about your employees' physical safety from an ergonomic point of view as well. So just making sure all those things are tweaked and changed to help them be effective. Raphael, I know you've got some other examples as well.
Yeah, I mean, number one, fast internet speed. So get the best one you can get. Wherever you can prepare, the VPN bandwidth is the second thing that people care about most. So making sure that VPN really works as fast as it possibly can. Number three is access. So making all the critical applications accessible to people who need to use them remotely. That comes also then a little bit back to the notion of practical security. What I've seen happen in China quite a bit, a lot of the frustrations for people have come from not being able to access the real work applications, and so having to find workarounds without actually being while knowing that they shouldn't use the workarounds, right? So a classical one, for example, is email attachment sizes are too small, and so you start sharing files via WeChat, which is against corporate policy, but hey, you need to share a file, right? And there is no shared drive that's accessible for the company. So that's where, from a central team perspective, I think it's helpful to give clear guidance down to employees how to protect themselves, work safely, but at the same time, then also from a company perspective to put the right tooling into place. What I've seen help many of my colleagues who work a lot from home is to put their desk in a place where the lighting is good. Since they're spending a lot of time looking at the screen, that helps with ergonomics. A lot of colleagues have bought these 27-inch 4K screens, which aren't that expensive anymore. So if you expect to work a lot from home, it might be company approved or non-approved, a quite good investment to make in order to have the real estate and also something you can really be productive on.
Thanks for that. There are some questions that have been coming into me privately as well, a lot around the hot topic of, as a leader, as someone who's working remotely as well, how to really set those operating norms, right? So I think we talked about this extensively in plenary, but any practical, tips or ways that you can, as a leader, have that conversation with your teams, and maybe what are some of the operating norms that maybe, or topics that may not be top of mind, just reflecting, ergonomics is something I hadn't personally thought about. Are there any other kind of topics like that that maybe wouldn't be as intuitive or top of mind for folks?
Yeah, I actually think there's a really important one here, which is just sharing how you're managing your day. I found it really helpful, with a number of colleagues to just be able to say, listen, you might run your day differently, but I thought I'd share kind of, here's how I'm thinking about structuring my day and how it works. And you get an enormous response of, actually, that's really interesting. I'd love to know how 10 other people do it, and so on. So maybe in some of your kind of community sort of chats or whatever else, just sharing a bit more humanly about, here's how I'm thinking about it. What do you think? What are other people doing? And I found that I've learned a ton from other colleagues about how they've thought about their days, that just little micro habits, right? What are the micro habits that you're putting into your day and how you're structuring it, that, you can learn from each other around that. So number one is absolutely share this stuff, because people are desperate to learn, gosh, how should I think about this? Not because there's a right answer, but there will be a right answer for me. And that probably comes from, 25 different micro habits that I'm applying for myself. And 13 of them overlap with Anka, and 5 of them overlap with Raphael, and that's okay. But sharing those micro habits, I think, can make a very, very big difference. So that would be my top tip on operating models.
Yeah, there is one, when I talk to colleagues in China and clients, I think there is one notion that many struggled with is, how do you build trust? Right? How do you build trust with people that are not part of your core team, but that you have to interact with? And so there was one client situation where we shifted, starting a new team, onboarding lots of new folks. How do you really get them to build trust? And so the mechanisms that we tried out, and not all of it worked, but some of the things were really spend time one-on-one, adopt a mindset of openness, goodwill, right? Reading twice, interpreting the best that you possibly can to avoid misunderstandings, and just a general, as the leader, tone it down a bit. Be very conscious about how how the way that you communicate reflects on what people are willing to share back with you, and make it a safe environment, and making sure to connect the dots. those are some of the things that helped a bit to overcome and then have a stronger element of trust building in teams and people who had never met each other in person before they started to work remotely together.
Yeah, and just this is maybe a silly one, but just around the role modeling of this. Two things that I think you can take from leadership more broadly and apply here, right? Number one is just think about when you're sending emails, when you're scheduling things, right? If you start scheduling stuff at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, or you're still sending emails at 11 p.m. at night, it's going to reverberate around the rest of the organization. They're going to feel like, doesn't matter what you tell them, they're going to feel like the same as expected of them. Even if that means queuing your emails to not be sent until the next morning, right? There are plenty of ways in which you can do that, but really thinking about, even if you are working at that point, your role modeling and what you send out to other people has a big difference. So think about that. And the second is, if you can imagine what it's like in a normal corporate environment, when you see somebody running down a corridor, it inflicts panic, right? So think about the equivalent of your running down a corridor, right? Which you would never do. The equivalent of that is in some ways rushing from one Zoom meeting to another and almost looking quite harassed and coming in from the side as you do it. That in some ways is your equivalent of running down the corridor. And so think about how you can just block, maybe it's 5 minutes before every single Zoom meeting, so that you're arriving cool, calm, collected, composed, any other word that begins with C, to make sure that that you're not, as I said, running down the corridor.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And I think we've now reconvened everyone in plenary. So as you can see, we're having a very rich discussion in our breakout. So with that, welcome back. And Kate, Raphael, I'll turn it over to you for final takeaways on this important topic.
Yeah, of course, very happy to. And look, thank you everybody for bearing with us. We're really quite overwhelmed by by how many people have joined this. One thing that would be super helpful, we've still got the chat open for the next few minutes and so on. Please do just share back any kind of key takeaways that you have. I think if everybody on this call took away just one thing to do differently on Monday morning with your teams, we'd love to hear what that would be. And I think we'd each love to share it back with the broader group as well. And we'll commit to synthesizing a bunch of this so that you have those tips and tricks. Sorry. So please do share your one key takeaway with us on the chat as we go through this. Just six actions, right? We try to keep this super, super simple. Number one, as we said, just take a breath, right? Use this weekend perhaps to think about how you're going to structure your day differently as of next week. Use what you've learned over the last couple of weeks about what's not worked to say, what do I want to change going into next week? And engage your teams on it, right? Some things will be working for some of them. Some will be monumentally, epically failing for others. And just talk about it and use maybe this afternoon, maybe over the weekend to just do that. Number two is the work policies do matter. The policies and the guidelines as well. And helping people to understand what resources they have access to, how some things that work brilliantly in the work environment are going to need to change. We talked in our breakout about the notion of sort of the ergonomics and the sort of desk working that is really, really clear in the office, hasn't often been updated for what that means in your home when you're sitting on a dining table chair and struggling with the height of the table that doesn't move, right? Number three, I thought this was super in what Raphael said, thinking about the smaller cross-functional working groups. I've had so many clients in the last couple of weeks say to me, gosh, Kate, how do I make this change for good? We're working so much better cross-functionally when we get it right remotely. I don't want that to revert when we're all back together again. So thinking about how you get your teams to work in smaller teams, the classic sort of 2 pizzas, can I feed my team with 2 pizzas type size, as well as how you make that a new norm if it really is working for you. Fourth, of course, make sure your tooling is up to speed. Spend time with your CTOs to say, what is our suite of tools that we have for all the different needs we now have in working remotely? I need to share files. I need to collaborate. I need to be able to chat. I need to be able to have sufficient bandwidth. And maybe that is about putting, surge devices into certain people's homes where you've got critical people. Number 5, learning. We are seeing so many people say, gosh, why don't I use this as an opportunity to reskill myself? If I've got maybe a little bit more time and I'm working from home, or at least a little bit more flexibility over my diary and no friction cost of traveling, what is it I need to learn? How do I use this time to do that? And really thinking about your own learning journeys as you go through this. Sometimes that might just be, how do I learn how to use Zoom better? And other things, it might just be, gosh, maybe now's the time to really understand what that data science team does in our organization, and how do I make sure that we do that? And then finally, and probably most importantly in all of this, how do you lead by example? The role modeling here matters. And it matters at a level that I think we've probably never seen before from a leadership point of view. Every single thing that you do is getting amplified in the organization. You're having to communicate more than you ever thought you had to do. Every action that you take is being interpreted and misinterpreted at a level that you've never seen before. And all of that while you're working in probably the biggest extent of ambiguity that you've had to work in as a leader. And so really thinking about every action that you take, every choice that you make, the trade-offs that you're making on your own structure of your day, that will be seen, interpreted, and as I say, often misinterpreted at an amazing level. So look, I'm going to pause there, but I just want to say thank you for so many of you sticking with us through this.